All right, so let's get right into it. The first movie I'm going to review for my channel is one of my favorite movie adaptations from one of my favorite novels from one of my favorite authors, and that's Stephen King's Misery, starring Kathy Bates and James Caan. Directed by Rob Reiner, who, if you don't know, Rob Reiner actually directed A Few Good Men. He directed Stand By Me. He directed When Harry Met Sally. So this was definitely out of his genre, but I think he did an amazing job. And also, rest in peace to him and his wife, who tragically passed away in their home last December, and their son was charged with their murders. Yeah, so that's unfortunate. So, Misery opens up with our main protagonist, Paul Sheldon, played by James Caan, finishing up his latest novel at the Silver Creek Lodge in Silver Creek, Colorado. Now, Misery it takes place in Colorado, but it's actually filmed in and around California and Nevada, specifically Truckee, California, and Carlson and Clear Creek, Nevada, which plays as the Silver Creek Lodge. So anyway, Paul is a very successful writer. He's known mainly for his Misery series, which is like a romance novel that's centered around a female protagonist named Misery Chastain, and it takes place in the Victorian 19th century England era. So Paul is feeling stifled as an artist, and he's kind of overwriting the Misery novels. So we see Paul leaving the Silver Creek Lodge, and he is getting into his car. There's a big blizzard coming, but apparently Paul don't check the weather because he's in a 1966 Ford Mustang, and it's a blizzard happening in Colorado. Yeah, that goes as well as you would think it does, and Paul crashes. I do want to note in the book, it's actually a 1974 Chevrolet Camaro, and either way, he ain't got no business in neither one of those cars in that weather. So he crashes, and then there's the fade to black. In the next scene, we're with Paul in his agent's office, and he's basically talking about being done with the Misery series and wanting to go in a different direction. And let me tell you something, Paul's agent is about that coin, honey, because by the looks of her office alone, she's getting paid from Paul. I mean, she's got floor to ceiling windows all across the office, black leather interior, okay? She's got cherry wood. She's on the 54th floor. She's overseeing Manhattan. Her office is very indicative on how successful Paul is as an author, okay? So he's having a conversation with his agent that he's done doing the Misery Chastain story and he wants to go in another direction. And she is looking at him kind of like, Paul, can I ask you a question? Why are you hating on a bad bitch? Why are you trying to keep a bad bitch down? So in the next scene, we're back at the crash site with Paul, and he's in very bad shape. He reared off the road into a snowbank. His car is upside down. He's barely conscious. It does not look good for Paul. But alas, you hear somebody break open the car door and start to pull Paul out. And through like the haze of the accident and barely being conscious, Paul can barely hear somebody audibly say, "I'm your number one fan." And then it fades to black. Now in the next scene, Paul is coming to, and he's now in a bedroom, and there's a strange woman standing over him, and she announces herself as Annie Wilkes, played by the incomparable Kathy Bates. And then she also reiterates that she's his number one fan. Now, Paul is highly medicated and still in very bad shape. But lucky for Paul, Annie is a nurse. Ain't that lucky for Paul? Look at that, child. She was able to reconstruct his legs using just tools around her house. She was able to pop his dislocated shoulder back into place. I mean, what are the odds of all people to find him in his crashed up car in the middle of nowhere, buried in a snowbank? It was Annie the Nurse Wilkes. Won't he do it? Now, I want to get a little bit into the set design of the guest room that Annie has Paul recovering in. The set design was done by Gary Norwood, who also worked on movies like The Princess Bride, and he worked on the set design for Hook. So the Misery bedroom that Paul is in is designed to feel claustrophobic, to make you feel isolated, which is where this situation is. Paul is in the middle of nowhere in this isolated, little cabin house with a woman he doesn't know. And they really wanted you to feel that in the shots inside the room. And also, they used a lot of angles that were kind of down looking up at Kathy Bates' character, just so you can kind of get the feel of how Paul is feeling being bedridden this entire time. He's constantly looking up at her. She's constantly towering over him. So they really wanted you to get the idea of feeling like Paul in such a vulnerable position. And I think they did a really good job with that. During this conversation between Annie and Paul, Annie lets him know that the roads are all closed and the phone lines are all down due to the storm, but as soon as they are back up and running, she will call whoever he needs to call, because Paul is concerned. He does have a daughter, and he was supposed to contact his agent once he finished the novel to let her know that he was back on his way to New York. Obviously, he wasn't able to do that. But Annie assures him that once the phones are back up, she will make any phone calls that he needs. We also find out during this time that, oh yes, in fact, Annie is Paul's #1 fan. And she knows quite a bit about him. She knows all about his superstitions. She knows that he has to have a cigarette after he completes a novel, along with 1 glass of Dom Perignon. I, to this day, pronounce it Dom Perignon because of this movie, and I'm not changing it. I don't care. She also lets him know that our dear good friend, Annie the Nurse Wilkes, was actually following Paul, and that's how she was able to find him when he crashed his car. She knew that he'd be at the Silver Creek Lodge and that he was working on a new manuscript. So it wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence. Annie's just a nutcase. Yeah. Won't he do it? No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't send people like Annie to you. Absolutely not. So this didn't make Paul nervous enough for me, because that would have threw up a whole bunch of red flags, but maybe it was the meds. Now, in the next scene, we're back with Paul's agent, who's played by Lauren Bacall. I don't think I said that before, but we're back with his agent in her fabulous Manhattan office with the floor-to-ceiling windows all across the office room, with the cherry wood, with the black leather interior furniture on the 54th floor overseeing Manhattan. Yeah, we're back in that office. And she's called over to Silver Creek to speak to the sheriff because she's concerned about Paul. She's like, hey, he hasn't called me about our next check, and I'm concerned. She's like, listen, can you go and look for my cash cow? I need to make sure he's good. And the sheriff is like, it's probably nothing to worry about, but I'll look into it. And so he starts his search. And this is where we meet one of my favorite side characters, Buster the Sheriff. He's not in the Misery book, but he's in the movie him and his wife are written in as kind of a comic relief. But I like them. I think they're cute. They're really adorable. He's played by Richard Farnsworth, and she's played by Frances Steinberg. I'm sorry, I'm not really familiar with her, but I thought they both did a great job in this movie. I thought they served as a great comic relief as a cute little old couple as he's searching for Paul. So Buster begins his search for Paul. At first, he doesn't think there's any real reason for concern, but he does start to notice little things like the tire marks that skid off the road. And there's even a scene where he just misses Paul's buried car in the snow, like the tire's poking out and he just passes by it. So it does build that kind of tension throughout the movie of it almost being right there. And I think that makes for great storytelling. So we're going to jump back over to Annie and Paul. So Annie mentions while shaving Paul that she noticed that there is a new manuscript in his satchel. Another thing Paul has to keep with him due to his superstitions, he keeps all of his fresh work in this brown leather satchel. She noticed there's a new manuscript in it, and she asked if it would be okay if she read it. And Paul, being the ever so gracious person that he is, why would he deny the person who saved his life an opportunity to read his latest work? So he agrees. Yeah. It didn't take long for Annie to express her disdain for the new novel, and mainly surrounding around profanity. Annie is a very kind of clean cut, if you will, in a way type of person. She doesn't like the swearing or anything like that. So Paul is trying to explain to her, like, listen, it's a story about inner city kids. I was one of those kids. We all talk like that. And boy, does this send Annie over the edge, because she looked at him and whipped her head around like, excuse me? No, everybody does not talk like that. You think I walk into the store and I'm like, hey, give me a pound of that bitchin' cow feed, or here's one big bastard of a check. And she's going off, and Paul is just in the bed like, because he's bedridden. He can't do anything. He has 2 broken legs and 1 dislocated arm. So he's assed out. And then Annie soon realizes that she let her mask slip, and she quickly tries to grab it and put it back on, but it's clearly too late. And she immediately starts to apologize profusely to Paul. Oh, Paul, I'm so sorry. It's just, I love you, Paul. You're mine. That's all. You're mine. You're so brilliant. You know, and she leaves out. Now, Paul is officially scared, as he should be. So there's another scene where Annie comes into Paul's room, very excited to introduce him to her pet pig, Misery. Yeah, she has a pig she named Misery. And Paul at this point is pretty much over Annie. He's realizing that something ain't right. And I want to point out that actually in the book, Paul recognizes something ain't right about Annie quite quickly, quicker than movie Paul does, but it's okay. He gets there eventually. But Annie comes in also holding the newest Misery installment, which is Misery's Child. Now, earlier I told you how Paul was done with the Misery chapter of his life. He was done with that series, and he kills her off in this book. And Annie loves Misery. Like, I think she loves Misery more than she loves Paul. And she is so ecstatic about reading this new book, and Paul is not really thinking that. I mean, to me, I'd be like, oh, damn, she's about to read this, and I killed this bitch off. I would be petrified. But anyway, Paul's calmer than I would have been. So Annie trips off to go read it. And sure as shit stinks, she is not pleased. In the middle of the night, Paul wakes up to Annie standing over him, and she just says, you. And she starts freaking out. You killed her. And Paul is trying to explain to her from his very, very fetal position. No, it's not. Her spirit is still with us. He's trying to come up with anything to calm her ass down. And she's screaming, I don't want her spirit. I want her. And she's slamming the bed up and down, causing Paul immense pain. And I want to say James Caan is really good at emoting with his face pain, because you could like see it. It's so visceral, all over his face every time he has to emote pain. He's so good. But anyway, so she's flipping out. She's grabbing like chairs and slamming against the wall, breaking them and stuff. And Paul is now absolutely terrified. Annie then says to him, you're just another lying dirty birdie. And I want you to know, I never called anybody. Nobody knows you're here. And you better hope nothing happens to me, because if I die, you die. And she turns and walks out the room. So the next morning, we see Paul on the floor, because when Annie flipped out on the night before, he called himself trying to get out of bed and, I don't know, run with no legs. But he's on the floor looking like he's writhing in pain, because he is. And she's all, oh my goodness, Paul, what happened? Are you okay? Trying to help him up and put him back on the bed. And she's just very, very calm. She's very much different from what she was the night before. And she says, you know, Paul, I know it's me. I have a terrible attitude, and I'm working on it. I promise. I'm working on it. But in the meantime, I just want you to know that this was you. This was you, and this was your fault. So this is what we're going to do. You're going to burn that new manuscript you just wrote. And she rolls in a barbecue grill with his new manuscript on it and tells him to set it on fire, because they need to rid the world of this filth, flying farth filth. And Paul is not happy about it, and he tries to divert and say, hey, Annie, listen, we're not ridding the world of anything. My agent has a copy. We've sent copies to publications all over the U.S. You're not ridding the world of anything if I set it on fire. But Annie's his #1 fan, and she knows that because of Paul's superstitions, he never makes another copy. And because Paul is being so, I don't know, insubordinate, she begins to pour the lighter fluid she was holding all on his legs and on the cover that he's wearing. And Paul, rightfully terrified, agrees to burn his manuscript. So after setting Paul's manuscript ablaze, or forcing Paul to do it, Annie tells him she wants him to bring Misery back to life, which is like, what? So Paul obviously is not pleased about this, but what choice does he have? So Annie goes into town and she buys a typewriter, and it's missing the letter N, and she buys paper and brings it to Paul, and you know, she's all, use me for inspiration, and I know he wanted to punch. So at this moment, Paul notices a bobby pin on the floor while Annie is talking, and he utilizes her kind of naivety to get her to leave the house again by telling her that this type of paper is not good. It smudges when you rub it, and I would assume any paper that you immediately type on would smudge because the ink is still wet. But again, as crazy as Annie is, she is slightly naive, and she believes him, and she goes into town. Not happily. She definitely gives him an earful before she goes, telling him he better start appreciating her, and slamming the heavy ass paper onto his already broken legs. But anyway, she goes into town, and Paul utilizes this time to break out of the room. Paul looks around Annie's house, and I have to say the decor for Annie's house, I actually really liked it. I love the rustic vibe. I love that it's very quaint. I like that it's a little cluttered yet organized. I feel like so much of the house is Annie. Annie is the house. Just a bunch of cluttered information. Doesn't quite make sense. It's not a total mess, but it's not totally clean. Like, it's just, it's a lot going on in her house, and there's a lot going on in her head, so that checks out. Anyway, Paul's walking around Annie's house. Not walking, child. He's rolling around Annie's house, and he's looking, and he sees that there's a shrine of himself in her living room with, no lie, every single Misery installment, 2 copies. So she is, in fact, his #1 fan. And at some point, due to the picture that we see that's autographed of Paul Sheldon, they must have met in the past before. It is autographed. So he's looking around Annie's house. He grabs some of the pills she's been giving him for his pain and tucks them in his pants to hide away. He's contemplating on taking a knife, but then he hears Annie coming up the driveway, and he hurries and rolls back into the bedroom, just barely missing Annie coming through the door. This movie's really good at building those intense scenes with camera shots and the fast pacing, the close-ups. It really builds the tension really well. Anyway, Annie comes into the room right behind Paul when he just makes it back in, and she asks him, why are you sweating? Why are you sweating so profusely? And he's like, you know damn well why I'm sweating. I've been waiting for my pills. You got me here suffering. He plays on to her quite a bit in this. I mean, he utilizes what tools he has to defend himself, and that would be kind of feeding into her wanting to nurse him. He starts to kind of utilize that as some form of self-defense in a way. So our favorite Sheriff Buster is still on his search for Paul. He even enlists like a law enforcement helicopter to kind of survey the area from a wider angle. Fun fact, the pilot is our director, Rob Reiner, you know, on his Hitchcock tee with the little cameo. I love when directors do their little cameos. Anyway, still no sign of Paul, so the police department basically declare him dead. But Buster ain't buying all that. When they do find Paul's car buried in the snow finally, they're just like, yeah, he crawled out, animals probably got him, next. But Buster's like, look at this. Look at the dents on these doors. This didn't happen how y'all saying. Yeah, he got out, but not how y'all saying. It looked like somebody used a crowbar and pulled his ass out of this car. So Buster's going to keep on his search for Paul Sheldon because he doesn't like loose ends. So we're back in the bedroom with Paul and the typewriter. And let me tell you, Paul is on a roll, okay? He is on the road to writing something magnificent. Okay, so Paul is just over it. He doesn't want to do it. So he decides to put some random nonsense on the page to give to Annie to get her out of his face. But we're talking about Annie, the nurse Wilkes. She's not going for none of that. She immediately comes back in the room and tells him, absolutely not, Paul. This is some bull crap. You need to start from where you ended with Misery's child, with her in the ground. You're not going to try to scapegoat your way into another story. So Paul's like, damn it. And he starts to write for real this time. And Annie is quite pleased with the second attempt. She's so happy that she's dancing around, singing, talking about she's about to get her Liberace records together. It's about to be a party. And Paul is like, bitch, shut up. So Paul decides to take this opportunity to kind of manipulate Annie again and invite her to dinner with him to celebrate Misery's return. And she is ecstatic. She's just like, oh, dinner with Paul Sheldon. So she runs off and puts on her best Little House on the Prairie dress to meet Paul for dinner. Now, Paul had something up his sleeve, though, better yet in his pants, where he'd been keeping them pills that he had pulled when he left the room the first time. So he made a plan, a little makeshift cup. He was opening the pills and dumping the powder residue into it. When he and Annie are sitting at the table for dinner, they're about to cheers their wine, but Paul says, wait, let's do this officially. Go get some candles. Let's make this romantic. And she is just like, ah, and she runs to go look for candles. In the meantime, Paul's dumping the pills into her drink. Now, I feel like it's always been up to debate if she knew that he put something in her drink, because when she comes back, she lights the candles, they go to toast, and she knocks it all over the table. And I mean, she even lifts up the little goblet from the bottom half, like, oh no, it looked like she shook it a little bit just to make sure ain't nothing in that cup. Annie knew. She knew. And Paul, poor Paul. See, this is the face of just giving up. I am just through. Outside, Paul is at the typewriter working, and Annie comes into the room to give him his pills. Now, she's looking more chopped up than ever, and Paul notices and says, hey, you okay? And she goes, you know, this weather always gets me kind of down. You know, the book's almost done. Your legs are healing. You'll be wanting to leave soon. And once again, Paul plays into being, you know, oh no, I like it here. What are you talking about? Now, Annie might be crazy, but she ain't that stupid, because she turns to Paul and says, that's very sweet, but we both know that's not altogether true, which is very true. She then pulls a gun out of her robe pocket, and she looks at Paul and says, I have this gun. Sometimes I think about putting bullets in it. And then she just walks away. She walks away out of the room, out of the house, down the porch steps, where we get an amazing Dutch angle to kind of emphasize on Annie now being completely unhinged. She's like off. She's completely off at this point. So in the next scene, we then see that Paul has gotten out of his room again. This time, we get a little more in-depth about Annie's decor in a different way. As Paul's looking around the house, he stumbles across these photo albums, or more like collage of death. There's articles about the death of her father, articles about the death of the head maternity ward nurse at a ward Annie was working at, and then the death of a bunch of infants that occurred after Annie became head nurse of the maternity ward. She even had to go to trial for the death of the babies. Yeah, Annie is trifling on a whole nother level, way more than we thought. I also want to note that Annie and Paul, in the scene where she says she has the gun that she thinks about putting bullets in, they're wearing like matching pajamas, kind of like the design is kind of the same. And I thought that was kind of interesting, because in my mind, I really think Annie thinks that that's her husband, and it gave off that, like, that 1950s husband and wife wearing the matching pajamas set, even though they can't sleep in the same bed type of thing on TV. Yeah, that's what it was giving. Now, Gloria Grisham did the costume designing for it, and she said she wanted to keep everything very rustic, and there was a lot of, once again, blues, but there was also a lot of reds used in the wardrobe, a lot of tans again, a lot of greens, and I thought she did a great job. So in the next scene, Paul's tucked in quite tightly because Annie has strapped him to his bed. She says to him, "Paul, I know you've been out, and I simply can't have that." She goes into a whole diatribe about hobbling, and then she breaks his ankles. Now, in the book, she actually cuts his feet off, but the director, Rob Reiner, said that he wanted to tone it down for the movie. He also famously did say that he doesn't believe you have to lose something in order to learn something, and I appreciate that quote. I didn't want to see Paul Sheldon lose his feet. Also, I want to note that the effects in the movie were done by K&G Studios. So for Paul's, the legs that Annie broke with the sledgehammer, they actually used like a gelatin material, which gave it that effect. For the rest of the movie, where we see, Annie caring for him, they actually use like a foamy latex boot material that James Caan had over his legs to give that really bruised look on his legs, and it was very effective. So during this time that all of this is happening to Paul, Buster is still looking for him, our favorite sheriff. He even picked up a Misery book to kind of read into the mind of Paul Sheldon, I guess, looking for clues. I don't know what he thought he would have found, but alas, he does find something. He notices that there's a quote in the book that Annie says when she's on trial for the death of the infants at the maternity ward, and it's somewhere along the lines of, "There's a power higher than man, and I'll be judged by him." That's what she said on trial. That was written in the Misery novel. So this sparks Buster's attention. Not only that, when he's in town, the general store owner mentions that Annie Wilkes recently brought a typewriter and typing paper. Buster, the ever astute sheriff that he is, rushes over to Annie Wilkes' house. And also, the reason I brought up the typewriter is missing an N is because in the Stephen King Misery book, the novel, there's inserts of the Misery story Paul Sheldon is writing in Annie's house. And like I said, the typewriter is missing an N. So in the inserts of the Misery Return book that's in the Stephen King Misery book, everywhere that you're reading, if there's an N in the word, there's no N in what you're reading. I just like that they added that in. I thought that was so cool, and that's actually what made Misery one of my favorite books. So Buster's driving up Annie's driveway, and she can hear him. So she immediately runs into Paul's room with a syringe, sticks him, and then takes him, brings him over to the cellar, and throws his ass down the cellar stairs. Right as she's about to open up her front door, and right before Buster can knock, they meet each other. And she's all, "Oh, you're so sorry, you scared me." And Buster inquires about anything she may know about Paul Sheldon, and Annie just can't help herself and rattles on about every single fact you can possibly know about Paul Sheldon. Where he's from, where his parents are from, their first and last names, his mom's maiden name, his first fish, all types of crazy stuff. So then she realized, I'm rattling on, and she invites Buster in. Buster is kind of looking around as Annie is just talking about Paul Sheldon and the news of him missing and how, she was so distraught and hurt. And, he's just poking around. He comes across the room that Paul has been held captive in, and Annie immediately starts to explain that, "Oh yes, God came to me and told me that I was going to take Paul's place as a writer, and I've been trying, but I can't write like him." Seemingly pleased with what he sees, Buster begins to leave Annie's house, and before he can get down the porch stairs good, he hears something crash. And so he runs back up and he's calling out for Annie. "Miss Wilkes, are you okay?" And then he hears a man screaming. He opens the cellar door to see Paul Sheldon laying down at the bottom of the steps. Before Buster can get Mr. Sheldon out completely, Annie blows a hole through his chest from the back with a rifle. Dang, Paul. Oh my gosh, you just can't get a break. There go that face again. Just. So remember how I said the character Buster doesn't exist in the book? It's actually a state trooper that kind of embodies the character of Buster, but on a way smaller capacity. And he doesn't get shot. He actually gets stabbed, and then Annie runs him over with a lawnmower. So yeah, So anyway, Annie then, after shooting and killing Buster, says to Paul, I'm gonna have to put bullets in this gun now that I showed you before. Yeah, because there's gonna be more coming looking for him. Paul once again uses his to tell Annie, listen, I didn't finish the novel. Let me finish. Let me bring Misery back to life, and then we both can go. That way we'll leave the world with Misery. So Annie agrees, and she says she's going to start dinner. Paul's typing away. And as he's typing, he's also like lifting the typewriter up to build up his upper strength. And we know Paul has been there for a while because we even get to see the seasons change in the window. Like it goes from rain to snow, like we see the leaves fall. So we know he's been there for a couple of seasons at least. So as he's writing, you know, he's informing Annie, yep, I'm real close. We're almost done. Annie, you got to get ready. And Annie, you know, she's like, okay. And he's just like, hey, you know what I need, right? And Annie's like, of course she knows what she needs. She's his #1 fan. He's going to need 1 cigarette because he quit smoking except for after he finishes the novel. And he'll need a glass of according to Annie, Dom Perignon. And this time, though, Paul tells her he's going to need 2 glasses because he wants Annie to join her in the celebration of Misery's return. And once again, Annie is ecstatic. She really turns into like a little schoolgirl whenever Paul kind of engages with her on a level of like, yeah, have dinner with me, you know, oh, let's have a drink. She gets very giddy, very schoolgirl, and it's so funny to see how people will form these parasocial relationships with people that they don't know, even to this day. Like, yeah, she knows everything about Paul, but she doesn't know Paul, like, at all. Because if she did, she wouldn't have been bothered by the profanity. She would have known that he was a slum kid. That's where he's from. She would have also known that he can't stand the Misery series. So why would she ask him to bring her back if she knew and loved Paul so much? So, but whatever. So as Annie runs off to get the 2 glasses for the champagne, Paul grabs some lighter fluid that he was able to stuff into his pants when he got thrown down into the cellar. And he also had a match. So by the time Annie came back, Paul had the final pages to the Misery Return book and the stack that he had already written by him. So Annie's walking in all excited about her little luncheon date with Paul, only to see him holding the paper and then setting it ablaze, explaining to Annie that she'll never know how it ends, and lighting the stack on fire. Annie immediately flips out and goes to run to put the fire out. Paul lifts the typewriter over his head and slams it onto Annie's head. Annie jumps up. She's trying to gouge his eyes out. She falls to the floor. She grabs her gun. She shoots Paul in the shoulder. It's a damn showdown at the OK Corral in that damn house, child. And let me tell you something. Crazy don't die easy, because she got hit in the head with the typewriter twice. The second time in one of the most traumatizing molds of a person's head. She falls and hits the typewriter, and you can tell it's like a fake head, but to me that was always the most terrifying mold of a human head. And fun fact, it was done by K&G again, the special effects, and they said that Kathy Bates came into the studio to get her head molded, quoting Texas Chainsaw 2 lines, talking about some lick my plate, you dog dick. They was like, what? Child, I would have been hollering. I would have loved to have seen that. But anyway, so they're battling on the floor. Annie's on top of Paul. Paul grabs a ceramic pig that fell and bushes Annie in the face with it, ultimately, finally ending his nightmare. We flash forward 18 months later, and we're at the Biltmore, and Paul is having lunch with his agent, Miss Gould. And she's basically like, okay, Paul, it's been enough time, don't you think? And I want to get a boat. So how about you write about what happened in that house? And Paul gets up and smacks her with the cane that he now has to walk with for life. No, I'm just playing. He didn't, but he should have. Because why are you trying to monetize off the most traumatic moment in my life? But ain't that Hollywood? Anyway, he's just like, hell nah. Paul is still dealing with a lot of PTSD because in the final scene, we see a waitress walking towards him. And as she gets closer, it appears to be Annie Wilkes. But when she reaches the table, we see it's just a woman, a waitress at the restaurant. She looks at Paul and says to him, "I'm your #1 fan." Paul smiles at her politely and says, "Thank you, you're very sweet." And that's the end of Misery. One of my favorite movies of all time. I would go to sleep watching this movie. I think the entire cast did a great job. And I like how it delved into Stephen King's own issues that he had with dealing with his own kind of turmoil with his own writings, because he had written The Eyes of the Dragon before Misery, and it wasn't really received well by fans. Critics received it okay, but fans didn't. And it was a sci-fi. It definitely was a step away from what we know him for, which is horror thrillers. And it just goes to show that when people get pigeonholed, like, fans are very particular. They don't want to see you go in another direction. And these parasocial relationships have been going on for a very long time. Just remember, before the Barbs, before the Beehive, there was Annie Wilkes. Let me know how you like this video, and be good to each other, be good to yourselves. And if you have any recommendations for more movies you want me to recap, put them down. Like, comment, share, subscribe. See you in the next video.